TheCreepyForest.com.
It's been 5 days, Clementine thought to herself as she watched the sunlight fade away into yet another cold night. Despite it being the middle of spring, these people sure knew how to make a cell drop up 30 degrees from the come night. She shivered when she felt another breeze blew past her, wrapping her arms around herself. Per usual, she could hear the small groans and moans of the walkers outside of her cell. She presumed that her cell was being held by what seemed to be very close to the outer perimeter. Tonight, however, she saw the sounds of undead were unnervingly intense. She stood up groaning as another sharp pain for her stomach. Her lack of food was starting to take a toll. She clutched her stomach, looking around for the 10th time that day. So far, she had found no way out of her predicament on her own. The walls were sealed on all sides in thick concrete. The window had been metal bars stuck into deep in the window frames, and the door was too heavy for her to push. She pondered ways to get out, telling the creaks of the door to open and make her jump. 2 armed guards entered the cell, brandishing the large assault rifles in their hands and a handgun on their belts. Between when they came, John Myers held his hand together and put it behind his back. He eyed Clementine up and down, his eyes darting over to a pool of vomit, one of them beside the chairs. "I see you're making yourself comfortable," he teased, raising an eyebrow. "Well, this room service here sucks," she replied with a shrug, "but other than that, I'm peachy." Myers chuckled, smiling down at the woman, and hunched over only this of just how tall the man really was. He cleared his throat, straightening up the back of his neck. "Mr. Madison tells me you've refused to take that test." Clem crossed her arms and glared up at the man, despite what her brain was telling her. There was no way that she was taking out the 3 fully armed men in their state. She settled for her own stares and witty remarks. "Why does it matter if I'm pregnant or not? You'll give me special treatment?" she mocked. The edge of Myers' mouth curled up again. He crossed his arms to the match of her stance, his legs bound together as if by invisible rope. "You've got spirit, kid. I can give you that," he said, nodding at her. "We could use someone like you in the Red Arm, a fierce, strong fight survivor, a damn great fighter. I hear you got many scouts quite a run after their money before they had to knock you out." "Well, 3 against 1 isn't really fair," Clementine pointed out, flinching when her stomach grumbled. Myers looked down at her, smirking. "You getting hungry?" he asked. She definitely didn't want a response to that, instead choosing to glare at him. Rolling his eyes, Myers snapped his fingers and the 2 guards stepped forward. Clem backed off, preparing for a fight with raised fist. "We're not going to hurt you," the older man reassured her. "See, but there's a herd coming our way. Nothing we can have handled, of course, but sometimes those pesky walkers manage to sneak in one or 2 of their kind inside. Being so close to the wall, I don't think you appreciate being torn apart should that happen to occur here, right?" The 2 men seized their arms from behind, getting a little resistance from the woman. There was no point in fighting that, she knew. They dragged her out of the cell, giving her the first look outside as they had been since she'd been locked in there. The hallway was bound as well as mixtures of headlights, lights, and very small candles very few feet. There were several similar cells on either side. Clementine figured a few of them were occupied from the banging on the metal doors. They once walked in at the brisk pace, making her trip on her feet more than once. Once they were outside, the light from the street lamps almost blinded her. They were on a dirt path leading towards the white building a few blocks away. As they opened Richmond's lively atmosphere, the compound she had found herself in looked dull and devoid of life. A score of soldiers patrolled the streets, rifles at the ready. A few houses had been erected from either side of the path. Most of their lights were off, and Clementine could see a few silhouettes through the windows. As they walked, she looked up at the sky. Clouds were starting to make a cover of most of it, the black hue blocking out the moonlight. Myers, who was a couple of paces ahead of them, reached to the door and the white building and knocked on it twice. A doctor, who Clementine assumed was Dr. Mason, opened the door with a small smile on his face and spotted Clementine. "You're here for a checkup?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. We're leaving her with you till the herd passes, Myers corrected, pushing Clem forward. As a final precaution, he took a pair of cuffs from his belt and bound her hands together. Wouldn't want to lose her, would we? We sure as hell wouldn't, Dr. Mason said, draping his arm over Clementine's shoulder and pulling it to her side. Clem flinched a bit, but her cool as she was being dragged through the hall. She assumed it was the infirmary. On her left, there was rows of beds lined up against the walls, most of them unoccupied by a couple of men hosted, then men and women like that alike amputated arms or legs. Few of them even passed out, but one of them seemed to be weeping at the loss of his right forearm. Clutching the stump of it had been replaced. Real secure place you got here, Clementine thought to herself. Rolling her eyes, she ushered into a side of the door to the right. The doctor closed the door behind them. He gestured to her for a bed to sit on, and her eyes glued to him. She followed his instructions reluctantly, and she had her hands together on her lap and looked around the room. It had a few medical machines strewn all around, most of them seemingly to be out of order. Dr. Madsen took a seat at the stool near a complicated-looking machine and grabbed his clipboard from the table beside him. He clicked his pen and wrote something at the top of his page, looking at her sparingly. "So, Clementine," he said, "what do you want?" She huffled, annoyed that she had to deal with this man. "I take it that you're reluctant to take your test you already knew?" She brought her hands to her abdomen, looking away. He wrote something else and nodded to himself. "You see, I was being honest when I said we cared," he assured her, placing a hand to his heart. We've had our fair share of pregnant ladies come and by and go, and more often than not, they intend to want to stay with us." "Now, why would I do such a thing?" she snapped. "Well, for one, we have strong walls to defend from the outside. Guards patrol every night, trained with soldiers, so you'll never be threatened by medical equipment." He checked in with the points off of his fingers, gesturing them to the machines when they got close to his third statement. "Talk about the security with those amputates outside." She jerked her thumb towards the door onto the other side of the room. Madison chuckled, shaking his hand. "Those people probably have found their progenitor recently, most of them who have been not bitten. Fortunately, they were mostly located in expendable extremities." "Right," she said, snorting. "And the ones that weren't?" "Some that couldn't be saved, unfortunately," he said, somberly piercing his lips. "But we tend to focus on the positive sides. We've given them a choice to stay with us, as long as they can pull their own weight. I know, President, that may be a proposition for you." "You'll have until this herd passes, then." His speech was cut off by a blaring of alarm somewhere outside. Mason stood up in his seat. His eyes widened. He had stared at her for a moment before clearing his throat and taking a keychain from his coat. "I gotta go check on what the ruckus is about," he said, trying to keep his voice from trembling from doing a horrible job of it. Clementine smirked. "Then you better go," she said, slowly raising an eyebrow. "Wouldn't want to keep you long." He eyed her with slanted eyes and opened the door behind him. He then reminded her not to move. Closing the door back up, she heard the distinctive sounds of the lock clicking and rolled her eyes. "Where would I go, dumbass?" Obviously, she wasn't going to go anywhere and get his words to stop her. He stood up, distinctively looking around. She searched the wooden cabins on one or the other, huffing as she could only find gauze and tape. Outside the door, she heard footsteps rushing from one side to the other. People on the other side were screaming. "What's going on?" she asked herself as she rummaged through yet another shelf, only to find it was empty. She was about to search, though, when another loud clang rang in her ears. Someone, or something, was banging on the door from the other side. Luckily for her, she found a tiny scalpel hidden on one of the drawers. She pointed at the door, prepared for the worst. 4 bangs later, she heard the sound of a lock breaking, and then the door was now ajar now. It all began to be pushed open slowly, forcing her into action, raising the scalpel. She rushed towards the door, taking hold of the first person that she knew that holding a sharp object near to their throats. It took a moment to realize that the scruff-grained beard and soft hazel eyes looking down at her. "Javi?" she exclaimed, dropping the scalpel, and made the cleaning sound as it fell near her feet. Javier Garcia straightened himself up, rubbing his throat with a smirk. "That's the Clementine I remember," he said in a way of introduction. "What are you doing here?" she asked, still unsure of whether this was a dream or not. She looked down at his clothes, which they were covered in blood and walker guts. The smell almost made her gag, but she kept it down, of course. He used my trick, she thought with a smile. Well, we thought we'd rescue you and then go get a bite at McDonald's, he suggested, scratching his chin pensively. She punched him on the shoulder, smirking at the man, and it was then that she noticed Gabe standing outside the door. His clothes were equally stained, as good as the portion of his face. He offered her a small smile, looking away downwards, dismissing the weird feeling that she got from his stance. She looked back at Javi. How did you guys find me? Whoever was keeping you locked up in here left a clipboard with your name on this rack. He pointed out with a small shelf with Mason's notes in it. I mean, how did you know where I was being held? It was all Lewis, he said, nodding. We fought like hell to get to you. Lewis is here? She exclaimed, looking around the hallway and beyond. She noticed it was empty now and the overlights were only being company had left. He and Asim went back to get into the holding cells to get you, he explained, taking the walkie-talkie from his belt and pressing the button. Guys, we got Clem. We're on our way to you. Static greeted them before a pair of their own. Gabe tapped Javi on the shoulder and said something in Spanish. Javi responded in his native tongue and nodded, looking back at Clem. We should get going, he said, taking the metal bats from his back strap. We may have lead a few walkers in with us. You did what? She asked, her eyes widening. We needed a distraction to move this place undetected. He replied, shrugging, and not everything went as smooth as paper. More like sandpaper, Gabe piped in with a frown, showing that Clem had a small cut on his forehead. Piercing her lips, Clementine followed the two men through the empty hallway. The beds on the left had been vacant. She noticed Javi kicked one of the front door down, looking around as they stepped inside. A soft drizzle started to fall through the sky, dampening the soil around them. She saw dozens of walkers roaming around the previously bare streets, their groans and glowings of the bullet volume as the bullets been flying off in different directions. Javi had led the two of them outside of the building onto the side surveying area. Clem kneeled down beside, realizes that they were just as dangerous as they were close to walkers. Two smaller ones wandered close to them, and Javi took them out with his hunting knife, taking care of them with ease. He slashed the abdomen of one of them open. Now, you can have some cover, he said. Stuttering, Clem dug her into the walker's inside, smearing the body and intestines around her clothes. She made her best not to gag at the smell, cursing her stomach wanted to hurl as the small dinner she had been given that day. When she was satisfied with her handiwork, she stood up and examined the area with Javi. A few people were running through the streets, doing their best to avoid the detection of the walkers. Most of the soldiers were using their ammo sparingly, presuming it because they were short on it. You guys know how to make an entrance, Clem complimented. It's the Garcia style, Javi quipped with a huff in his chest. Once they found a big opening enough through the small swarm of walkers flying down the streets, they slowly made their way through them. They walked in a straight line. Javi looked at the point and Gabe nodded at the rear. Clementine looked around and they trapezed through the undead, maneuvering with the bodies so no one from the red rouge arms reaching them would be the best hold of their hair or clothes. In barely 2 minutes they reached the edge of the large concrete building, and they took a second to look at each other for bites that they found nothing. Javi signaled to Gabe and the young man to flip on his flashlight, signaling the direction of this holding cell door. He made it back within a few minutes and pattered, and then he turned it off. After a few seconds of silence, broken by the moans of the walkers and the intermittent gunshots from the soldiers, a flashing light appeared from one of them's holding cell window. Javi nodded, and at the three of them made their way to the building without a question. By the door, two unconscious guards were on the floor, their rifles lying over them. Clem rummaged through the pockets of one of them, smiling when they gazed over a silver keychain. She took one of the cuffs, rubbing against her wrist until they fell to the floor when they were knocked out. The door opened to reveal Lewis standing on the doorway. His hair was in a matter of grime, a hair tie keeping it all in one place. His usual immense brown trench coat was now covered in walker intestines and blood. He's gonna be mad for a week, she thought, with a smile. It took her a moment to react to his presence, and sucking in a deep breath as she laid his eyes on the freckled man. Before she could snap out of her trance, she was picked up off the ground and spun by Lewis's strong embrace. She buried her head against the crook of his neck, small tears forming against his eyes. He was finally here. He'd found her. Her eyes stopped spinning, and as they broke tightly, looking into each other's golden eyes, bore down into one's intensely. Both of them glistening over the sheer of joy as the couple felt without hesitation. Clem brought her lips up to his, locking him in a passionate kiss. His hands ran down her back, settling into a wrist and waist and pulling her towards him. Her hands crept up behind his neck, her fingers digging into his dreads. She always loved doing that. They only broke apart when they heard someone clear their throat. The couple stepped back and ragged their breathing as their chests were heaving. Gabe was standing beside him, his eyes darting between them. Lovely reunion, but we gotta go before those more of those mortals show up, he said, making Clem roll her eyes. Unfortunately, his statement had become true. Soon enough, more than expected without an end, walkers kept flooding onto the compound, even though with a gap against one of the walls. The rain had poured down on them, dampening their blood-stained clothes. Javi looked at his sim and frowned. "Where's Violet?" he said. "The gunfire drew more walkers than I expected," he told Javi. "She stayed back with Ten and AJ just to make sure we had a safe route back when I gave her the signal," he explained, brandishing his flashlight to the older man. Javi nodded, but Clem was not pleased. "You brought AJ?" she exclaimed, her eyes widening at Lewis. "I tried to make him stay, but he wanted to come and rescue you," he defended himself, looking down at her. Despite the circumstances, he couldn't help but smile. "You raised a fierce little man." Clem squinted at him, but let the jab aside and nodding. "At least he's not in the thick of it," she thought to herself. Thunder clapped above them, bringing them back to reality. "I think we should split up," Clem suggested. "A big group cannot pass unnoticed in the herd." "She's right," Gabe piped in, nodding. "I'll go with Clem," Lewis offered. Clem smiled at her husband and placing her own hand into his. "You guys go ahead of us. We'll be right behind you." Nodding at the couple, Javi turned to the herd. "Good luck," he said, leading Gabe and Asim into the swarm of the undead. Lewis and Clem waited for a few seconds before going in themselves, huddling together as close as they can, as little space as possible. Lewis kept Clem close to him, making her take the rear. When she was pushed aside, she glared at him, piercing her lips. "I already lost you once," he breathed, shaking his head. "I'm not losing you again." At loss for words, she nodded and they slowly followed him through the herd. They made their way silently through the walkers, pointing out the small windows where they could be thinned out the most. Lewis gestured to a large gap on one of the walls, claiming that it was their way out. They rushed to it at a brisk pace, avoiding the detection from the walkers. Unfortunately, someone had other plans. Near the opening, something grabbed Clem's arm and yanked it off to her left. She made her best effort not to yelp, whispering, "Lewis!" Under her breath, the freckled man turned in the spot and a captor through the walkers. Getting caught up to two large ones blocked his path. To her surprise, she was thrown in the mud by whoever had grabbed her, turning around. She saw Myers standing over her with a large gash on his cheek. She stood up weakly, grunting from the effort, making her sore muscles. Myers cocked the gun, pointed the barrel directly at her stomach. "You think you could just walk out of here, huh?" He barked, his voice a hoarse. Lewis finally caught up to them, gasping when he spotted the older man pointing a rifle at his wife. He stepped forward and placing himself in between Clementine and Myers. "And who do we have here?" the older man asked his face. "A boyfriend, perhaps?" "I'm her husband," Lewis retorted, his face controlled in anger. "And we're walking out of here whether you like it or not." "Is that so?" Myers mocked, looking around. He made a show of pointing out small windows that they still had. "Well, I don't see your gun, boy. So I guess I have no choice but to stay, and have a little chat with me. If you want to shoot her, you're gonna have to get through me." Lewis shot back, his yell almost completely covered by another thunder cracking through the skies, lightening up their faces, and Lewis managed to get an angry look at the man. His beard was shaggy, his gray hairs were growing in every direction. Blood from the gash trickled down his cheek into his military uniform, staining his green eyes. His assault rifle was gripped tightly in both of his hands, its barrel almost aimed at Lewis's chest. Myers let out a medical laugh, his brief hitching and turning into a cough. Lewis then stood his ground, protecting Clementine the best of his abilities. The man accomplished himself quickly and training to take his aim on Lewis. "I don't want to shoot you, boy," he growled. "Well, I'm not letting you take my wife again," Lewis snapped, stepping forward. Calling his bluff, Myers took the opportunity to shoot. His bullet found found Lewis's shoulder, making the freckled man gasp in pain and flinch backwards, clutching it with his left hand. Before Myers could finish the job, heard a second gunshot beside him and looked up, his eyes setting on Clementine. "Drop the gun," Javi's deep voice said, had venom in his words. Reluctantly, Myers obliged and threw the rifle onto the muddy ground. Raising his arms slowly, Javier moved slowly towards it, taking it and standing beside Clementine and Lewis. The woman took the opportunity to kneel beside her husband, who was cleaning at the place where the bullet had gone through. "Are you okay?" she asked, investigating the wound. Luckily for him, the bullet had seemed to have gone straight through. "Yeah, I'm all right," he assured her, giving her a small smile. "It's just a scratch." "We're leaving, Myers," Javier barked at the old man and his own rifle, full trained to his head. "It's over." "So just like that, you leave us," he barked, his previous smile disappearing. It was replaced by a tense glare, his eyes boring into Javi. "Big man Javier, come to destroy another community. Didn't you have enough kicking us out of Richmond that you had to come sneaking out? You gave us no choice," Javi yelled at the man over the rain, the raising gun at Myers' attempt to take another step. "Don't make me do this. You could still get out." "What's your point?" the older man growled, raising his hand against his gesture behind him. "Look what you have done. There are families here. Children." Lewis's eyes widened, looking up at Javier. The leader of Richmond shook his head as he lowering the barrel slightly. "You've been living off your communities for years, and you don't want to play the sympathy card." Myers raised his eyebrow at the corner of his mouth, curling up. "It's this about this woman? What's her name?" He thought of a loud, mocking tone in his voice. "Kate. Don't you dare say her name!" Javi bowed, raising a rifle again. His hands were shaking from the adrenaline coursing through his body. "That was all you, Jav?" But he never got to finish his sentence as the bullet, as Myers was being shot by Javier. Lewis watched his eyes as the man's body crumpled down to the ground, and of course, Clementine holding Javier's handgun. They had nothing to say as Clem stood up and holstered the gun under her belt. She helped Lewis up and smiling at him. "I'm sorry," she said, smiling cheekily. "I couldn't let them get away after what he did," she added bitterly, looking back at the body of the man who had kept her prisoner. "Don't sweat it, Ashley. You beat me to it," Lewis assured her with a chuckle. "I love you," he whispered, planting a soft kiss on her forehead. "I love you too," she said, closing her eyes. "You don't taste too good," Lewis teased, scrunching up his nose and sticking out his tongue. "You know that's as Sim felt that day when we played Truth or Dare." "Touchy." "I don't want to ruin the moment or anything," Javi said, bringing their attention back. His breathing was still heavy, and a few strays of tears had swelled in his eyes. "But can we get going?" "Sorry," the couple said in illusion. Clementine smiled and sadly at Javi, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. The trio trekked the rest of the way back to the gap, making sure to avoid the walkers at all costs, the blood and the guts on their clothes beginning to wash off. Javi and Clem took care of the stragglers who got too close to them with their knives, creating a path for them to follow. Once outside, the number of walkers decreased. Clem, Javi, and Lewis made their way outside to the tree line. Once they got there, a blur of movement made its way towards Clem, knocking her out the air out of her lungs. AJ clung to her as if his life depends on it. She returned the gesture, squeezing the boy tightly. "I missed you," he whispered, his neck buried deep into the crook of her neck. "I missed you too, goofball," she breathed, crossing her eyes, fidgeting, fighting back her tears. "Thanks for coming to get me," she said, nodding at the boy. "I couldn't let them take you forever," he replied, shaking his head adamantly. She ruffled his afro playfully and earning a giggle from AJ. "Oh, I almost forgot," Lewis exclaimed from behind Clem rummaging through his coat, her eyebrow raised. From inside his trench coat, he placed a worn-down cap with its signature D halfway through peeling off, a scratch of it torn its side, coupled with a splatter of blood on the left. He handed it to her, earning a beaming smile from the woman. "Thank you," she mouthed, looking up at it for the first time in 5 days. "You're not you without your hat, Clem."
Why, hello there, my little pretties. It's me, the Shadow Lioness. I hope you all enjoy my video of creepypasta. So, without further ado, if you liked the video, please leave a like. And if you want to survive my cave of terror, please hit the subscribe button down below. Leave a comment in the comment section down below. Donate to my Patreon when you can. And the only way you're going to survive me in the cave is you're going to have to sub to me and press the bell for notifications so you'll get to know when I upload. Well, without further ado, my little pretties, I'll see you in the next video. Sweet dreams, my little pretties.